when we started, it was because of the relationship that our CEO had with a handful of CEOs of some prominent sort of enterprise companies. The most clear example is Salesforce. And there was just some efforts that were largely just skunk works, and people just, a couple of industrious people at Salesforce with a couple of industrious people at Facebook, kind of hacking something together, and we were sort of the reference, and they were actually doing the work. But they launched something called Faceforce, and it was just really interesting. It was just sort of how you can, take the enterprise world and sort of marry it and intersect it with, the contact list and the social graph that you as a person have. Because, I may be a salesperson during the day, but, come when I'm finished that day, I'm, a mother, I'm a wife. I'm a husband and a father. Sorry.
Canadian.
I'm Canadian. Sorry. It's all, we're very egalitarian there. Anyways, the point is that by allowing these two worlds intersect, you saw some really interesting things happen, and we see this in our site today, where the people that join now are largely over 25 to 30 years of age, and they all have full-time jobs, and they're all part of these sort of vibrant ecosystems within the work, and sort of in their pastimes lives as well as their own social lives. And so the interesting thing that I see happening is this intersection of how we can provide utility into existing enterprise applications, because a lot of the people that you would gain knowledge from, for example, are already mapped out. And so, how does knowledge sharing, as an example, a very simple one, change in the face of that? I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. And you're seeing other sites already doing this reasonably successfully. That's one. But the intersection of sort of, your professional life and the ability to sort of get new leads because of someone that you may know through a social connection, or someone who knows someone else through that social graph. There's a whole panoply of, I think, interesting opportunities. And why I think it's so big is because it all of a sudden marries the best of an advertising model and a subscription model, and I think what you're going to see are very large, significant ARPUs generated on those types of businesses if it's done elegantly, and if it's done in a way where information is kept very, secure in a dynamic privacy model, so that what you're exposing to your work cohort is very different from what you're exposing to the soccer club, to the, your family, etc. But as long as those dynamic privacy rules exist, I think you're going to see a really rich ecosystem develop. I think one area where I think people have seen a lot of sort of value is in, the social graph, some would say, is just a better characterization of LDAP in the enterprise. And so what does that mean? And I think what it could mean is a completely different way to envision an HR system, a completely different way to envision sort of how corporate intranets operate, and how knowledge sharing operates within the enterprise. And I think it's fair to say that there are a handful of really large companies at this point that have expressed a fair amount of interest in working with us to figure out how that would work, especially because when they look organically, they can see that 50% of their actual staff is actually already a member for personal reasons of our site. And so I think that's where we're not as further ahead in the enterprise, obviously, as my colleagues on the panel, but I think that hopefully in the next year you're going to see something pretty meaningful in that area, and in those handful of areas. And there's a lot of really interesting larger companies who've sort of been the established leaders there who've approached us, and we're just trying to figure out how best and how scalably we work. That we do believe that there's a lot of value in what we're building in the enterprise, and I think, as I sort of talked about earlier, we're working with a handful of partners to try to create some really interesting reference examples and implementations that can show the opportunity that we believe exists. The first and foremost thing we need to do is enable partners to sort of have their own robust business model exist. So whether they're a subscription company, whether they're sort of a license seller, or some other different type of model, maybe it's ad supported, like you've seen some sort of the more consumer enterprise companies do. I think we want to be agnostic to that, and how we sort of generate revenue from that, I think, is still TBD, and it will be based on, frankly, what the successful implementations are that we can enable. And I think that'll inform it a lot. Registered users, it doesn't really matter how many people register on the website, but it's how many people are coming back and finding utility in it. Number two is engagement. Engagement is not the number of page views, but it's some combination of page views and time spent. So it's how engaged are they, how useful is the service, how useful is the product, and how fast are people coming back to it. And then number three is ARPU. how successful are we in generating revenue per user? Because the reality is there are a lot of people who work in environments that generate a lot of revenue for the people up here who don't have a corporate IT director breathing down their neck making these decisions. And I think the reality is that it's not necessarily the ad that's basically right in front of or impeding you getting to your word processing document. I don't think that's the intent. I think the point is that when you're participating in these behaviors, you're refining a model of who you are that can be used to then target ads, maybe not necessarily on that own place, but somewhere else better. And I think you see that happening already today, every day. And so I think the right company who finds a way to basically weave those two things together will be the proof point for it, but I do think it is very possible. So to the extent that you have these qualified, useful people on your site, and to the extent that those can be stitched together across a suite of applications, I think you don't necessarily ever get to a place where you have trillions of impressions, but you do get to a place where you have lots of qualified users who you understand better. Saying, take a company that's building an online word processing application, that's not us, okay? We're not in that business. But just to paint you an example of what they could do. They could launch this application, and perhaps that they offer a whole suite of these things, and with enough users using them, what they can do is you're getting essentially a free product, you're going to register for that product, they're going to understand who you are based on the registration process, and whether you like it or not, what is happening today is that information is used then when you're not necessarily on that website, but when you're on, pick your favorite news site, and all of a sudden, maybe you were writing a document to your wife or whatever about, hey, here's my pitch for why I need a new car. I don't care, I'm just making up a silly example. Yeah. The point is, all of a sudden, you're on yahoo.com and you see a car ad. How do you think that's happening today? And so all I'm saying is, the point is, this stuff already exists. What hasn't happened is the company that stitches that experience together. So my only perspective is that the opportunity exists, and there needs to be someone who understands the consumer framework and who understands the ad models to weave it into a consumer enterprise offering.